You may have noticed that jazz musicians use a lot of colorful chords. So what exactly are those chords that they're playing, and which ones do you need to know in order to play jazz? Let's go over all of them. So we're gonna break this down into 5 categories of chords: major chords, minor chords, dominant chords, half diminished chords, and fully diminished chords. We'll go over some of the possibilities, the basic construction of each chord, and where you might see some of these chords in jazz standards. So category number 1 is major chords. And the first chord we're gonna talk about is the major 7th chord, okay? And it sounds like this. This is C major 7th. Okay, and the way this chord is spelled is root, 3rd, 5th, and 7th. Now, all of these, by the way, just in case you're not sure how chords are built in the first place, are usually coming from the concept of a scale. So the C major scale has different tones: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then the octave up, right? So when we're playing just the root, the 3rd, the 5th, and the 7th, that's what makes up a major 7th chord. Keep this in mind as we go forward through all the other kinds of chords. Now, 7th chords in general are the default chord that we use in jazz. We don't so much use triads like in other styles of music. We always default to 7th chords, meaning we stack a 7th on top of the 5th. Now, you'll find major 7th chords all over in jazz standards. Here's one example in My Shining Hour. It'll sometimes function as a 1 chord, but even later on in the song, you can actually see that the 4 chord is also a major 7th chord. So will come up all the time. Now, the next major chord that we need to talk about is the major 9th chord. And this one is spelt root, 3rd, 5th, 7th, and 9th. And a C major 9th sounds like this. Now, a 9th is what we call an extension. Notice that we have this 5th note stacked up on top of the 7th. So to better understand this, take a look at a C major scale again. Okay, now when we look at this, we have the root, the 3rd, the 5th, and the 7th in between all of these different scale tones. Remember, we have 1 and 2 and 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. And then finally, we could call the octave 8. But if we continued up to the 2nd octave, right? Then we have what we call the 9th, the 11th, and the 13th in between these, which are actually the chord tones. Now, you could also think of the 9th as being the same as the 2nd tone of the scale, the 11th as the 4th tone, and the 13th as the 6th tone. However, the important thing to understand about extensions is that these are added on top of the chord. They don't replace any of the core chord tones, the root, the 3rd, the 5th, or the 7th. That's why we call them extensions. And before going forward, one other thing to note is that these are what we call closed position voicings. In other words, you might not play this way at all on the guitar or on the piano. These are just how they're constructed, and you'll want to think about different ways you can voice these and use different inversions when we're doing this. But this is just so that we understand the construction of these chords. The next major chord is the major 13th chord. And the major 13th chord sounds like this. Now, all again we're doing is we're adding the 13th on top of the chord. The 13th in C major is an A natural. Now, another thing you'll notice here is the way this chord is drawn out. We actually do have the 9th in here as well. It doesn't mean if you're voicing a chord on a guitar or piano that you have to include the 9th. It's just this is the way we build chords and we're stacking them like this in closed position. Now, the next major chord is the major 7 sharp 11. You may have noticed that we didn't have an 11th extension there. We skipped straight to the 13th. That's because we can't put just the natural 11 in a major chord. It sounds kind of funny. However, we can do a sharp 11 chord, which sounds like this. Kind of has more of a dark sound to it. And once again, you can add the 9th into the voicing, but you don't have to as well. It just depends on what you're trying to do. Now, we've talked about extensions and altered extensions like the sharp 11, but there's also a other kind of major chord, which is actually where we're replacing one of the chord tones, the root, the 3rd, the 5th, and the 7th, with a different scale tone altogether. This one is called the C6 chord. And these kinds of chords are used especially in earlier styles of jazz. So for example, All of Me, 6 chords are used quite often for the major chord. chords. So as you can see with this particular chord, we have the root, the third, the fifth, but then this A natural actually replaces the 7, and instead we're playing a 6. So there's no 7th. So that's the difference between these kinds of chords. Instead of it being a 13th where we add it on top of the chord and it would still include the 7th, in this particular case, we're subbing out the 7 for a 6. Let's go on to the second category of jazz chords, which is minor chords. The first minor chord is the minor 7th chord. In this case, we're looking at a C minor 7th chord. And this chord is spelled root, flat 3, 5, and flat 7. So if you know your natural minor scale, this is exactly where all these chord tones are coming from. So where can we find these minor 7th chords in jazz standards? Well, taking a look back at My Shining Hour, we see F minor 7 actually functioning here as a 2 chord. We also see a C minor 7 chord acting as a 1 chord. And so there's a lot of different ways you'll see minor 7th chords come up. And by the way, if you're not quite sure what I mean by 1 chords, 4 chords, and all this other stuff, please do stick around to the end of the video where I'll share with you something else that will help you understand everything about chord progressions. So just like on major chords, we can also add extensions to the chord. So in this particular case, we can play a C minor 9. And again, we're just using the root, flat 3, 5, flat 7, but adding the 9th on top of it, the second scale tone. Now, unlike the major 7th, on the C minor 7th, we can actually add the 11th, which would sound like this. This is a really nice sound for a minor 7th chord. And because that 11th isn't clashing with the major 3rd like it does in the major chord, it works great with the flat 3 in the chord structure. Now we can also add a 13th to minor 7th chords. And again, just as a reminder, we do have the 9th and the 11th in this particular voicing, but if you're a guitar or piano player, you may or may not choose to use those extensions alongside the 13th. And minor 7th chords actually don't have any alterations that we can use. However, like the major chords, we can add substitutions for the chord tones. So the first one is a minor 6 chord. This one works great in the case, for example, if you're playing like a 2, 5, 1 in a minor key, landing and resolving on a minor 6 sounds really good instead of a minor 7. And this one is spelled root, flat 3, 5, and then 6. Now the minor family has another really cool chord where we substitute a chord tone, and that's the C minor major 7th chord. And it sounds like this. Another great one where if you're playing a minor 2, 5, 1, you can substitute it for this chord. Now, just as it implies, instead of using a flat 7, a minor 7, we're using a major 7, a natural 7. So it's spelled root, flat 3, 5, and major 7. And by the way, if you're wondering what's the best way to get to know these chords and how they actually perform in jazz standards? Well, the answer is learning more jazz standards. The more jazz standards you learn, the more you'll see these chords at play and functioning in different ways, and the more you'll understand them. So I have a free guide called Learn Jazz Standards the Smart Way. I'll leave a link to that in the description. It'll help you learn the melody to jazz standards by ear, but also my free masterclass that comes with it, Jazz Standards Mastery Formula, will teach you everything you need to know about understanding, learning, and improvising over jazz standards. So you can get all that for free. Click the link in the description down below. Now let's move on to category 3, which is dominant chords. Now dominant chords have the most possibilities out of all the chords in jazz, so pay special close attention here. The first chord is the dominant 7th chord. In this case, a C 7th chord. Sounds like this. And the formula for this one is root, major 3, 5, and then flat 7. So it's kind of in between the major and the minor 7. It shares the major 3 of the major 7 chord, but it also shares the flat 7 of the minor 7 chord. Now, as far as where do we see dominant chords within jazz standards? Well, everywhere actually. So oftentimes, for example, in the case of this B flat 7, it's acting as a 5 chord, or right here, it's a 5 chord in the key of C minor. Or right here, it's actually a dominant 4 chord in C minor. Or right here, it's actually a dominant 6 chord in the key of E flat major. But also dominant 7th chords are really the key of the blues. So in this case, E flat 7, it's a 1 dominant 7th chord. A flat 7 is a 4 chord. Right? So the blues really is mostly comprised of dominant 7th chords. So just like the major and the minor, we can also add extensions and alterations on top. And the first one would be the dominant 9th chord, right? So just adding the 9th on top of the chord. The next extension we can do on a dominant 7th chord is a 13th. In this case, a C13th. Really excellent extensions to add on top of a dominant 7th chord. Now this is where things get really, really interesting. There are a lot of altered extensions that we can add on to dominant 7th chords. And in certain contexts, especially when we're approaching a 1 chord or a new tonal center, it's a great idea to use these. The first one we can do is a dominant 7 flat 9. And again, all this one is the same as the C9 chord, just making that 9 a flat 9. We can also do a sharp 9, so a C7 sharp 9 chord. Another great idea, some people dub this the Jimi Hendrix chord. Now, Thelonious Monk's favorite chord is the dominant 7 sharp 11 chord. And then finally, we can do a dominant 7 flat 13 chord. Really taking any of the extensions that are possible and flatting and sharpening them. Now, because you can do so much over a dominant 7th chord, sometimes you'll see a chord like this on a jazz standard chord chart, altered chord. So in this case, C7 alt. And it looks kind of crazy here. That's just simply because we're looking at a closed position voicing to show you how it's built. But essentially it includes all of the altered extensions that you can possibly do, the ones that we just went over. However, when you see one of these on a chord chart, it's important to know that it's not necessarily asking you to play all of them. It's really just kind of giving you the option to choose which one you would like to do. For example, this is a combination of a sharp 9 and a flat 13. But I'm not including the sharp 11 or the flat 9. But if you're a piano player, it's possible that you could actually play all of these extensions and alterations at once. So don't get confused when you see an altered chord, it just means you can kind of pick and choose. Now, like the major and minor chords, we also can substitute a chord tone. So we have the C7 sus4. So you notice we didn't have the 11th extension, but we can have a sus4. And so that would sound like this. Now this is great if you're doing like a pedal at the beginning of a tune. That's the sus chord. And then going to the top of the song. So this one is spelled root, and then the sus4 is actually replacing the 3rd, and then the 5th, and then we have the flat 7. Now, if the dominant 7th chords was exhausting, don't worry, things are about to get a lot easier with the last 2. The 4th category is half diminished chords. And so in comes the minor 7 flat 5 chord. Sounds like this. And this one is spelled root, flat 3, flat 5, and then flat 7. So the only difference between it and a minor 7th chord is that it has a flat 5, hence a minor 7 flat 5 chord, but we also call this half diminished. Now, going back to my shining hour, we can see this most often showing up as a 2 chord in a minor key. This is almost 85% of the time what you're going to see, but it also can show up as a 6 chord as well in a minor key. So the two most common areas you'll see is a 2 chord in a minor key and a 6 chord in a minor key. Now, as far as extensions and alterations, there's really not a whole lot of things that jazz musicians do to these. So really the only one you truly do need to know is this one, the C minor 7 flat 5. And of course, if you're a guitarist or a pianist, plenty of voicings and inversions to go along with those. The 5th category is the fully diminished chord. And for jazz, we use diminished 7th chords, which sound like this. Which you can conveniently move up in minor thirds to create the different inversions of that chord. Now this one is spelled root, flat 3, flat 5, and double flat 7. And once again, there's not really any alterations or extensions that we add on top of diminished 7th chords. So all you really need to know is how to make a diminished 7th chord and you're good to go in jazz. Now, where do we see this playing out in jazz? Well, for example, we have it playing out here in Have You Met Miss Jones, where we have a 1 chord, F major 7, going to a F sharp diminished 7th chord, going to a 2 chord. And we would call this a sharp 1 diminished chord, and it acts as what we call a passing diminished chord. Another example of passing diminished chords comes here in Someday My Prince Will Come. And in Someday My Prince Will Come, we have a 3 and then a flat 3 diminished 7th chord. Sounds like this: D minor 7, D flat diminished 7, 2, 5, right? So diminished chords are often used as passing diminished chords within jazz standards. So these are all the jazz chords you need to know, but you also need to understand how to combine these chords together to make chord progressions in jazz. So I have a video on the screen right now that shows you every single jazz chord progression you possibly need to know. So go ahead and click on that one next. Make sure you like this video if you found it helpful. Please hit subscribe and we'll see you in the next video. Cheers.